Welcome, everybody, to International Podcast Day 2019. I am Dave Lee, co-founder of International Podcast Day. And as you can see, Jullian is here joining us from the
Hey,
Philippines today. Jullian, how are
oh,
you today?
I'm still nervous. Oh my gosh. Yeah,
It's
just
good,
just
man.
arrived. Yeah.
Yeah, it's going to be awesome. I'm glad we've
Yeah.
connected. This is,
Mm-hmm.
I think, the third year in a row that we've had a podcaster from the
Mm-hmm.
Philippines
Yep.
represented to share their story, their message,
Mm-hmm.
what's going on in the podcast space, both personally and over there. So
Yeah.
can't thank you enough for joining us. I'm glad we connected. I think it was probably over on Instagram,
Yeah.
and
Probably on
but
Instagram.
yeah. So before I pass the reins over to you, I'm going to quickly run through our Podcast Day sponsors, and I cannot thank them enough for making International Podcast Day 2019 a thing. Our platinum sponsor is Blueberry, and Blueberry is a full-service podcasting company providing hosting, statistics, and advertising opportunities. You can find more over at blueberry.com. And our gold sponsor is repurpose.io. With Repurpose, you can automatically convert your audio podcast into engaging videos and upload them directly to YouTube, Facebook, and other social media channels. You can try Repurpose for free using repurpose.io/IPD. And Libsyn, another great gold sponsor for the event. Libsyn is a podcast hosting, distribution, and monetization solution for audio and video podcasters worldwide. You can reach your audience everywhere on the most popular audience destinations like Spotify, Pandora, and more. Head over to Libsyn.com for more information. And of course, we'd really like to thank our streaming partner this year, which is StreamYard. Find their free accounts and their other paid accounts over at StreamYard.com. As podcasters, I know you're getting into live video. This is a great place to make it happen. And finally, I'd like to thank our celebration supporters. These are Second Line Themes, Geeks Rising Podcast Network, Synth, Outlier HQ, and Focusrite. So one more time, head over to internationalpodcastday.com/sponsors, where you can find some free giveaways that our sponsors are doing and even some discounted products and services. Well, Jullian, thank you
Yep.
again so much for joining here. We are looking forward to, and you're going to be sharing about the impact of starting a podcast. And you started it after getting some inspiration from some of the first podcasters in the Philippines,
Mm-hmm.
and you learned some tips and tricks. You're going to share that and kind of share where you're currently at with your local podcast. So thank you for joining, Jullian, and welcome to International Podcast Day.
Here we go. Thanks a lot, Dave. Here we go, guys. Hello, I'm Julian. First of all, thank you to everyone involved in International Podcast Day. So Dave, Steve, everyone behind the studio, all the sponsors for making this event possible. I've actually followed International Podcast Day like a year ago because of a friend of mine who also did speak at the event. So yeah, so let me introduce myself. So I'm Julian Sibi. Uh, I'm a I am a software dev actually by the day. So I just came from work. It's insane. Then when I'm not at work, I do a tech blog. So it's at reallyrandomtechie.com. And I'm also, yeah, why am I here if I don't have a podcast? So yeah. So I do the Creator Life podcast. It's a podcast that goes to the minds of different creators. So I've been talking to a lot of bloggers, social media influencers, entrepreneurs, designers, developers, basically everyone that creates stuff. So yeah. So funny enough, I got into podcasting because of my love of technology. So my love of technology was there first before I got really into podcasts. And most of the podcasts I've been into are basically tech podcasts, like news podcasts or like interviews of tech people. And it's very interesting how you get a lot of interesting things you see with other people in tech and around it. So yeah, I listen to a lot of tech podcasts, but lately, yeah, I've been the first exposure I have. So when I was starting my podcast was actually a fun story because it was like 3 years ago. Yeah, it was like, or I know, not three, 4 years ago. So it was around 4 years ago where I had friends of mine who were one of them also aware of podcasting, but not. I don't know if he's really into it too. His name is Ramsey. So it was just like four of us friends, like me, Ramsey, Carlo, and Richard. So we started this random podcast. He called it at first. He called it Blogger Banters. It was like an update podcast. So it's like basically talking about our what's up with us for the week because we did it weekly, kinda. So it was like I would give something about my week, like something happened to me, or I went to a certain event in blogging, or then my friend is there talking about his new video, and it's really funny to imagine that that would be that would I would ever do such a thing like a podcast, because back then it was just like for fun and it was like just a conversation with friends. But then I think it was last year. It was last year when I encountered two people that started podcasting, and it really inspired me to start one. So first up is Isa Perez. She's a content creator here in Cebu, Philippines. She does Isa Please, and she does a podcast called Isa Talks. She actually talked here in International Podcast Day, I think the previous 2 years and even last year. So I actually watched her speak about her topic at that time, and yeah, it was really interesting, and I was really inspired to start one. And I think I was already starting by the time I watched the stream. It's really interesting. So yeah, it was Isa. Because the funny thing enough, she did it through Facebook Live, and it was really insane thinking about that. I do not nothing that crazy of the sort, but yeah, that was her thing. It is amazing. Another podcaster that really inspired me to really start with is Carlo Villarica. He's the founder of a local website here. It's called 032.com. He started 032 Conversations. It's a podcast basically about local creatives here in Cebu, Philippines. And he has really talked about a lot of interesting things when it comes to being in the creative industry. And it was really amazing that he was able to talk to these creatives at length, like at I think the length goes like for an hour and a half, 2 hours, sometimes three. Kind of regretted it a bit. And yeah, ever since I got some inspiration from both of them, then I started the podcast, and it's really an eye-opening experience for me. I really didn't think that I would be actually do it. So yeah, funny funny thing. When I first started doing the Creator Life podcast, I didn't have I didn't have this mic here, so I didn't have this mic here with me. So all I had was a laptop, just a laptop. I didn't purchase anything. I only used my laptop, and it was weird at the time because yeah, I already expected the sound quality to be so bad, but I just really wanted to start the podcast, because if I didn't start at all, then what's the point? Then when I couldn't wait to share the stories of course, when you start something, you have to contact your friends. It's usually what happens when you start a new thing. So yeah, I asked my friends if they could be on the podcast that I was starting, and we were just doing it on a laptop, just doing it using a laptop, just the built-in microphone of the laptop, which in hindsight, it was insane that I even got that out because the audio was really bad. And I tried so hard to do editing. Yeah, this is one thing I really learned when I started the podcast. It was like, I can't believe I had to edit so much, but it was all worth it since I didn't want too much background audio to interfere with the content of the podcast. So yeah, I first started it. It was like just the laptop. That's just it, the laptop. Then Few months later, after I started the podcast, I got a decent mic finally. So, in case you want to know, this is an Audio Technica mic. It's just a USB mic. I kept the setup fairly simple. It's so that I can move around, and I don't really have a studio or whatever. So having this mic just be portable enough so that I can move around while doing the podcast is really handy for me. I've done podcasts in coffee shops. I've done it here in the house. I've done it here, basically anywhere I can be. That's really conducive to fun conversations, and it's really fun to do it in some places where it's actually noisier than you thought it would be, and it's really a challenge to do background. But I've recorded in like some spaces where it's fairly quiet, so that was really easy for me to edit after the fact. So yeah, so I just it's just this mic, and just when I started, it was really just the laptop, which is really nuts. It's really nuts to think that I just started it with a laptop with the foregoing the sound quality. But yeah, I really wanted to start it. Otherwise, when would I start? So funny that I heard of podcasts before and I listened to a lot of them, but I used to think that starting a podcast would be super hard since you would need like audio equipment. You'd also need the distribution platform to start the podcast. But right right now, like just in the last few years, I could basically start a podcast even with just a smartphone, which is really insane when you think about it. I've known some people here in the Philippines that actually start their podcast with just a phone, and they just attach the mic to the phone and just record through there, which is really amazing how far technology has come to aid storytelling and podcasting in general. So it's really funny that just just by starting the podcast, you get to learn a lot of things, and you get to learn more about yourself as a person actually. Like I used to be not super talkative when I was back in high school. It was really feat for me to even talk straight for like 5 minutes. But now with the podcast, I can basically like talk straight, converse with people, and it's a growing process. I'm not saying it's just the podcast that helped with that, but it was through the podcast that went put it up to the next level. And I'm grateful to for making this step to do podcasting. I know it sounds like I'm really selfish or something, but yeah, that's what I really learned when I first started just starting this podcast. Like I learned more about myself as well. And there's this weird surge in popularity when it comes to podcasts here in the Philippines. Uh, Funny enough, Apple Podcasts isn't really that popular here in the Philippines either. Even SoundCloud is just used for like music mostly. The Funny enough, the most popular podcast platform here in the Philippines it's actually the fastest growing. I think it's Spotify, because I'm seeing a lot of podcasters introducing other people to podcasting through Spotify. It's really amazing. Like I use Spotify before. It's a music app. I actually have like dedicated podcast apps on my phone. But like for others who are not really aware of what podcasting is, you can just like ask your friend to use Spotify, especially here in the Philippines where Spotify is really popular here because of many promotions here. So like Spotify is really popular here in the Philippines. So getting getting people into podcasting is actually easier now compared to a year ago, 2 years ago, because through Spotify, I think we're able to like promote podcasting even more because it's already in the app. You don't need to download a separate app just to listen to podcasts. But some people actually prefer to listen to podcast apps, and yeah, it's really that easy. Also, I didn't really have like a lot of money to afford any podcast hosting platform for me, even though I have a blog. So yeah, I only started using Anchor. So it's anchor.fm. So it's a free podcast distribution and hosting platform. So you say two in one. So you basically upload your podcasts through Anchor, and then you distribute that. Anchor automatically distributes it to different services, which is really neat, especially for me who actually barely has time to deal with a lot of technicalities when it comes to podcasting. Even though I'm a techie, because I'm a techie, I there are some things I don't really want to deal with a lot sometimes, and one of this when I started out was how to upload and distribute the podcast. So it was really helpful that Anchor was a service that's there for me to start putting it out there and just putting it out there. And one thing that's also nice about podcasting here in the Philippines is like Filipinos are actually like uh, innate storytellers. We just need the platform to do it. And yes, there are like news outlets. Yes, there are like YouTube channels. Yes, there are other ways like radio. Radio is actually also still popular here in the Philippines. But I think that podcasts should also contribute to like a lot of storytelling. And I'm seeing a lot of podcasts that basically just tell horror stories. Because like here in the Philippines, you have a lot of superstitions and things that we believe, even though they're not actually true. But yeah, they're very interesting. Like we can hear like horror story podcasts. We can hear like uh, superstitions and stuff. But there are also most of the podcasts here are like either interviews or maybe like it's basically life updates. It's mostly like slice of life like that. Then I'm also seeing a very the podcast scene in the Philippines is like I can't even explain how many podcasts are here now that for personally for me like it's really shocking that there's a lot of podcasts out there and in the Philippines right now, and I'm actually grateful that I get to do this, and it's not something I thought that I would be doing back then when I was just doing my blog and doing a lot of things. But like, yeah, talking to a lot of people, to interesting people in podcasting, it's really amazing. And I'm glad that I'm able to share my experiences, my stories here in International Podcast Day. One other thing that a story that I have here is uh because of me starting a podcast, there are also others who are also inspired to do podcasting, which is, if you think about it, it's nuts that there are other people who actually get inspired to do stuff because of what you do. I still find it hard to believe that there are, even though I really don't take credit for uh, things that other people do because of something. But yeah, I'm really grateful that I get this platform and I get to share, to get to be an inspiration at least to some people out there who are also starting their own podcast. Like for example, I have this friend, her name is Frances. She just started a podcast. It's called Tech It or Leave It. It's a podcast that finds your true passion in tech one podcast at a time. It's really interesting. It really digs deep in the world of like tech in a way that not a lot of other podcasts are doing. Like we hear like tech when it comes to phones or like how it impacts others, like normal people. But then this perspective is more of like getting a job in tech or like being around tech, like being a software developer, being a designer, or just teaching other people how to be a programmer or be a software developer. It's really interesting that that kind of thing is also that kind of thing is a nice topic to have in a podcast. Another podcast that I discovered and found out due to inspirations is like a cup of tea and cookie. Yeah, the name's a handful, but it's by a fellow blogger. His name is Rabsin. He's actually part of the LGBTQIA plus and it's very interesting that he modeled this podcast to feature others, just to expose, just to be for everyone to be aware of that community, this community that for other people, people just shun, people just are not that aware. So it's nice to have a podcast that's about uh, being open to everyone and not just like being limited to a few people. Yeah. And one of the things I've really learned when it comes to podcasting is like it actually inspires. It's not just me learning from my guest, because in my podcast I do usually interviews. So it's not just me, it's just me learning from my guests. It's like a two-way thing, because like in my podcast, after I interview them and ask them some questions, actually give them an opportunity to ask me questions, because I myself, I'm a content creator, and maybe we have the my guest has perspectives, I have perspective, my own perspective as well. So we bounce around ideas, questions, and basically anything about content creation, anything, things that we do, and it's really nice to have that back and forth, and it's not just like me talking to do an interview or something. So yeah, really starting this podcast made me aware of a lot of things, and I hope to be able to continue to do to share more stories of people here, not just the usual bloggers, but also startups, also entrepreneurs, also those kinds of people. And it's really a great time here actually in the Philippines, because we're just starting our podcast scene here, and there's already a podcast network here. It's called Puma Podcast. So it's actually a play on words, because it's like we use the Filipino term. It's like we made it a Filipino term. So it's like a Puma podcast. So yeah, it's basically people doing podcasts. So that's a nice thing. And I've also been talking also to other podcasters who are not necessarily like just in close proximity to me. And it's really interesting to see this podcast community grow, not just here in Cebu, but also in Philippines. So that I'm really grateful that I even get to share the story, because it's just been more than a year since I started the podcast, and I'm really grateful for having this platform. And yeah, thank you. I think that's it for my story. I didn't think it would go that short or something, but yeah, it's basically it.
Hey, Julian, thank you for sharing your story. I know you're, what are you, 40 or 41 episodes into your
Yeah.
podcast adventure right now?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's funny how that became 40, because like I started it a year ago, but then like I had to have a break. I took a break. I think it was like from January to like March, because it was funny because I had to stop it because I went on a business trip, because it was for my day job. I had to go on another country and work there for like 2.5 months. So I had to stop the podcast, because one thing that I do in my podcast, I don't do it like online all the time. I usually do it like with the person and we record together. So it's really interesting to even be get the groove going again and have the podcast again. So that was really nice to even reach 40. I even can't believe my own consistency because sometimes I tend to be inconsistent with some of my content, and I'm really not keen on admitting that, but yeah, that's part of creating content.
Yeah. So out of your 40 episodes, what do you think is probably your most successful podcast that you've had? That maybe because you do an interview style podcast,
Mhm.
correct? Yeah.
Yeah.
So what do you think has been your most successful podcast through your first year?
So, funny enough, like I didn't expect. First of all, I didn't expect this to be super successful, but like I think one of the most successful podcasts I do is when if it's like when we just go on a random topic and it's not really. First of all, it just goes. First of all, I started the interview, but then it goes on like a very random tangent, which is like so funny to think about when you're basically just talking to another person. It's like imagine just talking to a person, like the person's in front of you, and then you're just putting a mic there and just you're just talking to the person, and it's really funny that that episode it's actually with a friend from Manila. Her name is Liz Escalona. She's like a gamer, she's a model, she's doing a lot of things right now. I can't even catch up on what thing she's doing. We were just talking about being nostalgic, and we're talking about the games we played in our childhood. We're talking about like deeper meaning when it comes to social media, how it actually disconnects us from other people rather than us being connected through social media. So that was like a really fun one, and I can't believe that that was really successful to the point that I'm still in shock even to this day.
Yeah, that's pretty cool. Sometimes it's the ones that you don't expect to be as most popular or the
Mhm.
conversation you don't expect to go. Um, have you historically been, like you said, you're relatively quiet for the most part, and the
Mhm.
podcasting has allowed you to kind of find your voice and be a
Yep.
little bit more outgoing. Did you always envision yourself doing an interview style, or did that just develop into just because you work in development, or how did that play out? How did your format of your podcast kind of form?
Ah. So about the format, it was more of like I really wanted to do it in interview style because I had like when I started, it was like I had a lot of content creator friends there. So like I just wanted to interview them and know what they do and what their outlook is. I even started it. I think I started it with we were talking about like common like topics about content creation. It wasn't necessarily about what I do or what my guest did. It was like a content creator topic thing. But after a while, I decided on removing that part. Like at first it was unconscious, but then I realized it's like, yeah, just let the interview flow. I just let it flow because sometimes when I stop it and then goes to that tangent, it's like very. Sometimes it feels kind of unnatural. So for me, I'm glad I stuck with the full interview, and then adding. Funny enough, the one thing that really stuck as I did the podcast was letting my guests ask me questions. Of course, I informed them ahead of time, but there would be like times where I forget. I forget to tell my guest about the forget to tell my guests about asking me questions. So they would be like on the spot, and it's like, who is this person? I don't really know you, but I will just ask you like some general questions anyway. So maybe I'll get something out of you in that way. So it's a really funny thing that I kept, but it keeps the podcast like unique and different in my opinion. Yeah.
It's cool. You don't often see, the guest turning the tables on the host and being
Mhm.
able to ask them question. I think that's really cool because Julian, it kind of opens you up to another layer of yourself where you're,
Yeah.
you're actually having to ask questions and be honest with yourself and
Mhm.
wherever that conversation goes. And I can
Yeah.
imagine, having that conversation shift a little bit and kind of takes it on a new tangent. You have something kind of out of nothing there.
Yeah. Funny enough, there was like a podcast where I think I recorded it recently where it's just like besides him doing podcasts, I literally knew nothing about the person. And then when we started recording and I found out, oh, he was a fan of this like certain thing I'm also a fan of. So basically the episode turned into like a fanboy episode. So it was like an hour, basically at least 45 minutes to an hour of just pure fanboy. And it was very funny that it turned out that way. Yeah. Yeah.
Well, that's going to happen. Yeah, I mean, it's there's people that you want to interview and you may not end up getting them, and then there's those random conversations that turn into something great. So, how do you usually go about grabbing your interviewees? Is it through a work connection? Is it through a recommendation from somebody else? Is it just you reaching out personal level on social media, email? How do you
Mm.
usually connect with your guests?
So it started out like, 'cause, yeah, when I started out, I had friends already. So I had friends who are into content creation. So like, why not start with them? It would be easier for me to just approach them. And then I think when I started like approaching people, it was like first it was like kind of hesitant because what's a podcast? Like I'm too shy to do this. But then like eventually when I cozy them up to the idea, no, there wouldn't, because what I do with my podcast, like I don't have any cameras around because like sometimes video is really popular now, but for me, because people here aren't really used to interviewing, unlike like the the people in my circle, especially in content creation, aren't really used to being on camera unless they're YouTubers or video creators, like doing vlogs. So I have to cozy them up to the idea of doing a podcast. So it's funny that they said yes and they're doing the podcast now. They're being on my podcast. For some instances, there are really people that I want on the podcast, and so I reach out to them through either social media or like emails. And sometimes it pans out, sometimes it doesn't, but that's the way it goes. And then like sometimes it just slows down, like you just have a random conversation on social media, like the public social media, but then it turns into like, do you want to be on my podcast? And it's like yes. And it's really interesting on how you, it's funny how you get people to say to how you find people in podcasting and how to get them to be guests on your podcast. And I still do that now, social media. I still do like, from once in a while I ask the guests I had on before, then I ask them back again. Because sometimes having them on multiple times, you get a certain other perspective, and you don't need to do sometimes. Because when I start interviewing my guests, it's like I do what they do, so it's like getting to know. It's also at the same time getting to know the person and what they do. But if it's like when the guest returns, so I can basically just skip all the introductions and just go with the talking, because they have updates. Because like we're not static, we're moving. So like while I'm doing this, they're doing that, and so on and so forth. So yeah.
So, what kind of podcast are you listening to locally right now in the Philippines? Is there anything that you're really interested in, that you're connecting with? What's sort of on your schedule and your podcast playlist in the Philippines?
So in terms of local, I only listen to like two of them right now, because it's like trying to fit more into, because I think I have like around 20, I listen to like 20 or 30 podcasts, which is like nuts when you think about it already. And most of them are like weekly, and then some of them would go together in the same day, so I'd had to fit in, and they're usually an hour or 2 hours. So two of the podcasts I listen to, one is 032 Conversations, the one I mentioned earlier in my talk. It's basically about creatives, see what they do and how they do their work. And sometimes it's really interesting to hear like not English. It's very interesting when I hear a podcast that's not in English. It's usually in my language. 'Cause in the Philippines, it's not just the Filipino language. We have hundreds of dialects, some of which people are in other parts of the world don't even know it exists. So, for my case, I'm in Cebu, so I speak Bisaya, which is like probably after Filipino, it's like I think the second or third most spoken dialect here in the Philippines. So hearing that is very comforting, and I've started to integrate that into my podcast as well. So it's not just English. So if my guest is very comfy speaking Bisaya or Filipino, if I'm talking to someone from Manila or something, so I don't actually force English on them. So it's really a nice touch to have a little local flavor in the podcast. So, and another podcast I'm listening to is Wake Up with Jim and Sab. So Jim and Sab are a married couple. They're actually one of them used to be one of them is a famous TV actress. Now both of them are in a band, and they're just talking about them. Just talking about life, what's up with their life, and they even do like seldom do mailbags where they ask their listeners question. They ask for questions from their listeners, and it's really interesting that they get like mostly it's about like relationships, it's usually about love life, and yeah, it's usually those kinds of fare, and it's sometimes it's really interesting to listen to those kinds of things once in a while.
So, Jillian, where do you see your podcast going over the next year, couple years? Is there anything that you're looking to branch into, or you wanting to do live events, or you wanting to get certain types of guests?
Mm,
Are you looking to grow your audience a little bit more, locally or across borders? What's sort of your short and long term goals with your podcast, being that
mm.
you're relatively new to the podcasting space?
Yeah. So short term, like I would still go local since I think there's still a lot of local, especially here in Cebu, where there is like I haven't talked to like everyone I could talk to here yet. And I'm not just talking to like bloggers or like YouTubers. I'm also talking to entrepreneurs. I'm also talking to software developers. I'm also talking to startup founders who are just here. They may not be locally here, or they're just Cebu based. So there's a lot of people here, and I've been debating of doing a live podcast or like live events, but I would have to like think it over and see how would that go, because I think that's probably in a year or two. I'll see what I can do about that. But basically it's more of local, and sometimes I would try reaching out to global guests, like people that are not uh are familiar outside usually. So those are some of the things I would do, and basically like I hope to do something more with the podcast, or maybe I'm also trying to experiment on a different type of podcast. It's gonna be like I'm not gonna talk to a specific type of person. The podcast would be about the conversation itself and not the person I'm talking to. So and it's gonna be over. It's gonna be a chit chat over coffee or something. So I'm looking for to branch out in that kind of podcast. So it's not gonna be an interview per se. It's more of just talking to me, just talking to another person about certain topics. And so, yeah,
That's pretty cool. With what you do with your regular work, your regular
yeah.
your 8 to 5 job, are you finding it? Did you find it easier to jump into the podcasting space just with your technical ability, and has that really helped shaped sort of how you created the podcast?
Uh, it's very interesting that it's very interesting. It's kind of a good thing for me. It's like kind of an advantage that I know technology first before I got into podcasting. So it's kind of an advantage, but it's an advantage for me. And yeah, it's like I usually like read tech articles like every day. So I know, and then I stumble upon what happens to be related to podcasting. So that's even more relevant to me. So I think having the technical ability makes it easier for me, but isn't any hard since there are still aspects like marketing that isn't really is it really related to my field? So I still have to learn marketing, still had to learn like how to brand myself, how to market myself to other people. So although having the technical in terms of like technology aspect is makes it easier, I think there's still difficulties in other aspects of podcasting. It's not just about putting out the not just about putting the podcast out there, but like sharing it, like promoting it to basically anyone or people that you think would be interested in the podcast.
So what sort of guests do you have lined up? Do you have a sort of a schedule for your next coming shows, or is it a week by week trying to see who's available? What do you have on tap for the creator's life?
So for the Creator Life podcast, funny enough, when I was like going through my list of guests that I've had so far, most of them are like women, which is like very a very funny observation that most of the guests I've had on the podcast are women. But I think that's, as Isa mentioned to me like a few weeks back when we did the podcast, I think it's about having most of the really good content creators here are like women. Most of them are women. So I need to work on finding like men on the podcast. But this, I'm very fortunate that I found like at least two men. One of them happens to be a podcaster, and one of them I have mentioned during uh fun the being the fanboy. Yeah, that's coming up real soon. I think it's this week. I'm not sure. I think I scheduled it for this week. And I think one tip I could give when it comes to podcasting, because like sometimes we get caught up with like recording and then releasing it right away. I think a good tip when it comes to podcasting, especially if you're just audio only, is to like stockpile as many episodes as you can, like record a lot and then just edit it. And for me, what worked for me is I stockpile all the episodes that I can, then I edit when I need to, then I just schedule them. So like what it I think it was May. Yeah. So around May when I had to go back to Japan for another business trip. And so what I did was to record 12 episodes, at least 12 episodes. I recorded them I think in a span of a month and a half, just record all of them. I didn't really mind if I hadn't started editing them yet. Then after which I would edit while I'm still there, and then I would schedule them. So when it comes out, I'm all I need to do is like share it on social media, tease it on social media, and all the things I do when the podcast comes out. So it despite having an 8 to 5 job, I I'm still grateful that I get to do the podcast, and doing the techniques that I'm doing right now really helps in not giving myself too much stress when I do it. So yeah.
That's really good to know. I mean, I think one of the things as podcasters we need to do is learn how to adapt to what we can do personally
Mhm.
and on a technical side. And if batching your interviews and sending them out is what you need to do, that sounds like a great idea. I know a lot of other podcasters that do that. So, Julian, do you have anything else you want to add regarding what's going on in the Philippines specifically? I found it pretty intriguing that you said that most of your guests are females, and
Yeah.
is that just because they make themselves more readily available, or is it they just work in the field that you are interested in interviewing for? I'm kind of intrigued on why the majority of it is the females that are interviewed on your podcast.
Yeah. So it's mostly the latter, where it's mostly on the field they're working where it's mostly content creation, because most of the females here are in the lifestyle kind of thing. So they cover like basically anything like fashion, food, travel. So basically they have a lot of content, and I think it also attributes to how much they share on social media compared to men. It's like the interests, how many interesting things that a female can share. Quite honestly, I think sometimes men are boring in certain aspects. So yeah, I guess it's they have a lot to share, and I think that attributes to being a content creators, having a lot of things to share. And yeah, I think more often than not, I think more of the people I know who are doing content creation are female. And usually when it's male, it's usually about tech, it's usually about food, it's usually about, I don't know, it's rare that I see lifestyle, because I can just like count like a few that I know personally that are into lifestyle, and they're male. So yeah, I think it's attributed to that. That's why I'm trying to reach out to more than just the usual fare, so that I could hopefully get more of the male people to come on the podcast. And luckily this month most of them are male, so very fortunate for that.
Yeah, because I know Steve and I, the other co-founder of Podcast Day, we actually podcast together and we do our own little technology show every Monday. And usually finding guests is really quite simple for us, and we really find a great mix of both female and male hosts to come join along. And we found everything in the technology space from here and overseas in the UK, and there's always something relevant to talk about. And that's pretty unique. I think that the most of your guests are females. But yeah, I just wanted to kind of pick your brain on that and kind of get an idea of
Yeah.
why that was. And sometimes, like you said, if they're more readily available, if they're used to more of the lifestyle blogging and podcasting, and they
Mhm.
want to have their voice out there, and they make themselves more readily available, that makes a lot of sense. If they would come to you and say, hey, let's record a podcast, you're willing to reach out to them just because they are being more vocal in that culture. That makes sense to
Mhm.
me.
Yeah. And I just hope that like there there also be more podcasters, but then I mean, yeah, there it's growing now, but like I think there's still room to grow in terms of podcasting, because like I also want to, funny enough, I also want to interview podcasters, because it's like I want to like share tips. It's like talking shop in a way. So it would be nice to know more, because like some of them are like podcasting but at the same time doing something else, like that is mostly their main thing. Yeah.
So you mentioned earlier, Julian, that you were pretty surprised at how simple it was to start a podcast
Mm-hmm.
before, and you've connected with Isa, who we've had on the two previous leaders representing herself and her blogging, her story, her message,
Yeah.
and the Philippines as well. And have you found it easier over your last 40 episodes to work on your production and work on the social media and the promotion of it? Has it gotten easier, or are you just finding it to be a little bit more difficult as you learn more, you want to do more?
Yeah, when I started it was like I didn't really, because before when I started the podcast I didn't like have its own, because what I do now is the podcast has its own social media accounts, so it has its own thing. But yeah, before I was just writing on my tech blog social media accounts, so it wouldn't overwhelm me a lot. But I found that putting focus on the podcast itself would be very beneficial for the podcast in general, rather than just mix it in with my tech blog. So yeah, I found it very advantageous for that way. And when it comes to other aspects, like, yeah, it's a good thing. It's such a good thing I found Anchor.fm, because like otherwise I don't I would I of course I would know through like YouTube how to's or stuff, but like I think being using this Anchor service like made it easier on my part to just like upload and then like just distribute it, because like I've heard before, like when I was, because I've been a podcast listener for a long time, and I've heard back in the day that this used to be hard, and you had to have to do do stuff for this podcast survey, for this podcast distribution, then you have to do another thing for this podcast distribution. And I'm just glad that it's easier to do that. Like other people who want to get into podcasting would just have a lower barrier to entry. Like they don't need to learn a whole lot of technical details just to start a podcast. And just talking about two of the people that got inspired to do a podcast as well, just it's basically a proof of that, because I think they're basically using the same service, if I'm not mistaken. So yeah, it's really easy now to do it. And yeah, I think I talked to Isa about updates, since we just had our episode. I think it's on the feed right now. And when she was thinking of doing the podcast again, like she initially got afraid because like her setup was insane, doing a Facebook live for an hour, then she'd pull the audio and then upload it. So doing a Facebook live, I wouldn't imagine myself doing a Facebook live for a podcast, because it's very taxing to like set up a camera with people's face, and yeah, it's really hard com- in comparison. Yeah.
Well, Jillian, I want to thank you so much
Yeah.
for participating this year with International
Yeah.
Podcast Day. And it's been great. It's your first year podcasting. I'm glad you're able to come represent yourself, share a
Yeah.
little bit of your story about getting started, the challenges, some of the
Mhm.
uniqueness of podcasting in the Philippines. I really appreciated learning a lot about it. And that's the intriguing part, is challenges and things that you're successful for
Yeah.
range from different boundaries in different countries. So
Mhm.
before we end this, tell everybody where they can go if they're interested in connecting with you and getting your podcast.
So yeah, my podcast, just search on any podcast app, The Creator Life. So I upload episodes every Friday. So in here in the Philippines, so it may be Thursday night there or wherever. So Friday here in the Philippines is when I upload my episodes. So you can just search in any podcast app, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts. So you can find the podcast there. My podcast is on social media, so I'm on all Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. So that's at Creator Life Pod. Yeah. So that's basically it. I don't wanna. I would have plugged my other stuff, but that's like, yeah, I wanted to focus on the podcast itself because that's what I'm here for. It's I'm really grateful for this opportunity to share my story, and hope to be able to do this another time. And yeah, I sincerely hope that another person gets to represent the Philippines next year, not me again or something.
No, we appreciate it. I know you and I, when we were testing, working things out, and you're going to serve as an inspiration for a couple people in the Philippines. So,
Mhm.
congratulations on that. So, Julian, again, thank you so much for coming over, representing the Philippines, and don't forget everybody out there in podcast land to continue to use the hashtag International Podcast Day.
Yeah.
Thank you so much. Have a good day.
Thanks. Yeah. Have a good day, guys.
All right.